Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Miriam. Welcome if this is your first time here. And today it's going to be quite the long video because I read, I think 18 books in May, which is quite the amount of books. So grab yourselves a drink, a snack, make yourselves comfortable. I'm so excited to talk about each of these books. I'll just take a moment to appreciate how adorable this mug is. It's Marie from the Aristocats, which is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated Disney cartoons ever. I love the Aristocats. And then it's her iconic saying, "Because I'm a lady, that's why." It's so cute. Anyways, coffee. I need my coffee. All right. So, May, as I was saying, was a really good reading month. I tried out a new author who I now believe to be a favorite of mine. I'm just so happy that I discovered her. So these books I'm not going to talk about in a particular order like I usually do from lowest rating to highest. I will start with DNFs though, and then the last books that I talk about will be my favorites of the month. I will leave timestamps in the description box so you can skip around to different books depending on which ones you want to hear about. So I'm going to get started with my DNFs. So I first DNF'd The Pilot's Daughter by Meredith Jager, and it has nothing to do with the book itself, the writing. I was just reading another World War II historical fiction, and I just didn't want to add another World War II historical fiction on top of it, because when I picked this up, I was in the middle of like 4 books, and it was just a lot, and the World War II book I was reading was very emotional, and I just didn't want to add another one on top of that. This is still on my radar, and I may pick it up again in the future. I did get this from the library, so I can always, check it out again, but I just decided to set this aside for now. Next up, we have a book that I was struggling so much with deciding whether or not to continue reading it or to set it aside, and I'm actually really glad that I DNF'd it, because I would have just kept pushing myself to read a book that I wasn't enjoying, and ever since joining BookTube, I've been a lot more comfortable with DNFing. Before, I would just power through, and even if I wasn't really enjoying my time reading the book, I just wanted to get it done, and I would feel guilty if I put it down. So with this book, it was a struggle to decide whether or not to DNF, but I ended up deciding to just stop reading it. I was not having a good time. And that is The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas. A lot of people have told me, and I've, seen on Goodreads too, that the plot takes a little bit of time to really pick up. But I just wasn't jiving with the writing, and maybe it has to do with this translation. But I just find, and I'm learning more about myself as a reader, that I'm not as interested in like this type of story where it's like knights or musketeers or like, soldiers fighting off evil and like joining the military and, fighting for his majesty. And it's not really interesting to me. Even if there is romance later in the book, I didn't want to keep reading. I didn't want to keep persevering to get to that point. It's a really long book, and I think I read like 15 chapters and I was just bored. So I decided to put it down, and that's okay. I'm still going to try The Count of Monte Cristo. That one I'll give more of a chance to, because it is a longer book, and I'm generally okay with, having to wait for things to pick up. But I think it's just the content of this book, and like, I wasn't really a fan of D'Artagnan, the main character. And I don't know, like, it was silly. There were some funny times. There were some funny moments in it, but overall, it's not a book that I want to keep powering through. Especially because like the premise just isn't something that I generally would want to read. So I decided to set this aside. I also DNF'd Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, and this one was honestly just a case of it's not for me. Honestly, I was expecting the writing to like just completely sweep me away. I had heard really good things about Ken Follett's writing, but I just didn't find it to be anything special. And the opening chapters have some content that I wasn't as aware of in the book. And like, I've read books with adult content before. I read Outlander, like that's something else. But it's just the way that certain things were described. It just made me very uncomfortable. It was just, no, like I couldn't. And then I looked up some trigger warnings and some more of the content, and I just don't want to be reading about a lot of sexual assaults that are happening. So yeah, I'm sorry if Pillars of the Earth is a book that you guys love. I couldn't get into it. So that one I also set aside. And then I'm going to go over some Agatha Christie's that I read. So my least favorite Agatha Christie that I read in May, oh gosh, it was not good. That's Elephants Can Remember. Honestly, I couldn't believe this is actually written by Agatha Christie, and I did some research into when she wrote this book and just her cognitive health and everything, and there is some evidence that she may have had dementia, and so this obviously just wouldn't have been her best work. We have Ariadne Oliver, who is friends with Poirot and a bunch of other characters that you'll see many times in Agatha Christie books. And in this one, she basically asks Poirot for help because a woman came up to her saying, my son wants to marry this girl. This girl's parents were killed years and years and years ago. I need to know if the mom killed the dad and then shot herself, or the dad killed the mom and then shot himself. Basically, this woman just wants to know because her son is marrying this girl. The premise was odd. It was just not well written and it was quite boring, and I ended up giving it 2 stars. So that is Elephants Can Remember. Then we also have The Murder at Hazelmoor, which is the older title for the Siddiford mystery. And this one was interesting. The beginning was more interesting, I found, than the rest of the book. So this one is another one of Agatha Christie's standalones, so it's not Poirot or Marple. And in this one, we have a group of people on a very cold winter's night. They gather together to play, basically, it's like a Ouija board type of situation, which I don't like that in books. It makes me very uncomfortable. And the board basically says that someone that they know has died, has been murdered. And then the main character of this book finds his friend dead, the man that was said to have been murdered. And, you know, the police are involved, and there is like an amateur sleuth type of situation going on with this girl who is trying to figure out how this man died. And it's okay. It's not awful, but I just wasn't really interested in the characters. Like, the writing was good, but the characters felt very, very flat for me. The mystery was okay. I wasn't like absolutely shocked at the end. I just don't like anything to do with Ouija boards and like seances and things like that. But the biggest issue with this book is just like the characters and the mystery, and that's really big for me in Agatha Christie. I need to be interested in the characters. So this one got 2.5 stars. Then we have A Murder is Announced, and this one I gave 3.5 stars to. I quite enjoyed it. And in this one, we are in a small town called Chipping Cleghorn, and the morning paper has an advertisement, and it basically says, a murder is announced, and then like this murder is going to happen at this address. And so the people in this town who receive the morning paper, they think this is just like a party type of thing where it's like a murder mystery party. And so they all show up, and lo and behold, it is not a lighthearted party. There's definitely something sinister going on. So I'm not going to say anything else. It's good to go into this one knowing as little as possible. I gave it 3.5 stars. I would have given it 4 stars. I really enjoyed the mystery. I did not see the twist coming at the end, and the clues were actually very like obvious. And looking back, I'm like, how did I not see that? The only thing that I had an issue with was a little bit of the pacing in the middle of the book. It kind of slogged, and I was, you know, not really as interested until like the last quarter of the book. But overall, it was really good. It was enjoyable, and this is definitely a very fun Miss Marple, and I'm glad that I read it. So 3.5 stars. And then the Agatha Christie that I gave 5 stars to this month is The Seven Dials Mystery, and I buddy read this with Katie from Paperbacks and Ponytails. She didn't enjoy it as much, and that's completely okay. But personally, I really, really loved this one. So it starts off with these characters in this kind of like a vacation situation. They're at this person's home, and they decide to play a practical joke on their friend, who they make fun of him because he like sleeps like a log. This guy can sleep through anything. He sleeps in all the time. And so they decide to play a joke on him and basically put a bunch of alarm clocks in his room with the hope of scaring him awake. But the prank does not go the way that they expected. And that's all I'm going to say about this one. I loved it. I think it was so fun. I think I really enjoyed how obnoxious the characters were and like following them. Like, I just didn't like really any of them. And the reveals at the end absolutely blew me away. The role of clocks in this story is really interesting, and this one is another standalone, although it is with Superintendent Battle, who has appeared in other Agatha Christies as well. And for it not being a Poirot, I'm really, really glad that I enjoyed it so much, because I tend to enjoy Poirot a little more, but so good, 5 stars, absolutely loved it. I also read books 1 and 2 in the Remnant Chronicles series by Mary E. Pearson. So The Kiss of Deception is book 1, and I did really enjoy this one. I gave it a 4-star rating. And in this one, we have a girl named Leah who was betrothed to this prince from another kingdom in this universe. And she flees. She doesn't want to marry him. She just leaves. She runs away with her friend Pauline. And Leah and Pauline end up in this other town, and Pauline's like aunt kind of take them in. They're working at this tavern, and then 2 men show up, and one of them is the prince that she was supposed to marry, and he's out looking for Leah. And then the second man is an assassin who's from another kingdom, and he's been tasked with killing Leah. And in typical YA fashion, there is a bit of a love triangle. I love how the 2 men know that Leah is the princess, but Leah doesn't know who they are. And another aspect of this book that I absolutely loved is that we know the names of the 2 men. One is Rafe and one is Caden, but you don't know who the assassin is and who the prince is. So the whole time I was reading, I was like positive that Rafe was either the prince or the assassin, and then Caden was either the prince or the assassin, but my guess was completely wrong. And I loved the reveal at the end. It was a really, really fun book. I think the aspect that I really loved about this book was Leah at this like tavern, this village tavern. I love that kind of setting. So yeah, I really enjoyed book 1, and I was super eager to pick up book 2, which is Heart of Betrayal. And I gave book 2 a 3.5-star rating. It was really good. I just wasn't as interested in the political aspect of book 2. It had a lot more to do with the kingdoms in this world, and specifically this kingdom called Venda, which is where one of the male characters is from. And it was interesting, but it just didn't capture my interest the way that book 1 did. But book 2 did end on a big cliffhanger, and so I was very eager to pick up book 3, and I'm currently in the middle of book 3, so really, really good so far. I also read a book called Letters Across the Sea, and this one is about a girl named Molly, and she is an Irish Canadian living in Toronto during the Great Depression. And then we have a boy named Max, and he is from a Jewish family also living in Toronto. And during the Great Depression, and obviously before that, and during World War II, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the world, obviously, but also specifically in Toronto, there was a swastika club, and it was just a very, very sad situation. There were a lot of protests, a lot of violence towards Jewish people, and basically Molly and Max have feelings for each other, but Molly being Irish, Max being Jewish, there's a lot of conflict between, I guess, their families, and it's just not a good situation. We get their perspectives during the war, and then as they're reconnecting later on. And it was a really cute story. I ended up giving this one 4 stars. There are some really awful things that occurred in Toronto, and this is based on real historical events. So this book has some really interesting themes, and it also looked at how difficult it was, obviously, to find a job during the Great Depression. So Molly is let go from different positions, and it's just a really difficult time for their family. And there's a lot of heartbreak in this book. Obviously, it takes place partly during the Great Depression and then also during World War II. And so there are some really good themes explored of PTSD and obviously, you know, xenophobia and things like that. And it was really well written, and I really enjoyed it. So that one got 4 stars. I also read The Heart's Appeal by Jennifer Delamere, and this is book 2 in the, what series is it? London Beginnings series. And I read the first book last month. And this one I unfortunately enjoyed less than book 1. So this one I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5, but it's honestly more like a 2.75 rating. So in the first book, it was about Rosemary and I guess like her story. She is a woman who grew up in an orphanage, basically with her 2 sisters. And this one is about her sister Julia. And Julia is a very ambitious woman. She wants to become a doctor. It's the late Victorian era, not so easy during this time. And I really enjoyed that aspect of her wanting to not be the typical Victorian woman and, you know, become a doctor. And then her love interest in this book is a lawyer, and he is basically on this legal team that is trying to win a court case against the hospital that she wants to, I guess, go to school through, if that makes any sense. So it's like they're basically enemies in a sense, and it's kind of like an enemies to lovers, but I was really annoyed with the romance because every single aspect of their romance was so cliche. And everything that they would say to each other was just, I've seen it so many times. I've seen it again and again in Christian romance, and just like even the lines, like I could predict what they would say next because it's just recycled content. And I don't mean to be so harsh, but I just did not find this book to be anything special, and I was quite disappointed with the romance. So unfortunately, it was not that great. I'm glad I read the first book though, because that one was a lot of fun. It had to do with like a theater, and this one I just wasn't as interested in. We also have To Steal a Heart by Jen Turano, and this was my first Jen Turano book, and I overall enjoyed it. I gave it a 3.5-star rating. And this one's about a girl named Gabriella who grew up as a street thief, and she's now an adult. She's kind of like changed her ways, but she has to basically prove her friend's innocence because her friend has been wrongly accused of theft. And so she goes about trying to do this. She meets an old street thief like friend from her childhood named Nicholas. And so they end up working together basically to try to prove her friend's innocence. Nicholas was actually taken in when he was a bit younger by this very rich man, and so he's doing very well for himself. He is a man of society, and all the society ladies are vying for his affections. And I enjoy that this book takes place in New York City in the 1800s, and I really, really enjoyed that. This book has a lot of intrigue. There are many situations that arise and are very humorous. I think I had really, really high expectations for this book, and they weren't quite met. I was expecting it to be super, super funny. Like I was expecting a ton of laugh out loud moments, and while there were some funny moments, and I think the banter was really well done between Gabriella and Nicholas, just overall, it was good. It just wasn't amazing. And so it didn't quite live up to what I was expecting, but it was a fun book, and I do plan on trying out some more Jen Turano books. So that is To Steal a Heart. Another 3.5-star read is The House on Foster Hill by Jamie Jo Wright. And this is, I think, my third Jamie Jo Wright book, and overall I enjoyed it. This was her debut, so it definitely was lacking in certain aspects, mainly the historical timeline. This book is her typical dual timeline, like more gothic, kind of atmospheric mystery. And the historical timeline, if I did not have 1906 written for me on the page, I would have had no idea that it was a historical time period. It was just so underexplained and underdescribed. Like there was nothing to indicate. I think like a wagon with horses was mentioned, and that's about it. Like nothing else to indicate that it's, you know, it's partly historical fiction. So that was a little jarring, but I honestly, because I had such low expectations and I had seen people mention that it was lacking in that regard, I went in with really low expectations, and I think because of that, I ended up enjoying it more than I was expecting to. The mystery itself I found very intriguing. The writing was solid for a debut, and it definitely did have some very suspenseful moments. So I overall enjoyed this one. I didn't even tell you what it's about. Basically, this one is about a woman named Kane who is a widow, and she buys a house that belonged to her grandfather in this old Wisconsin town, and it's the house on Foster Hill. And then in the 1906 timeline, we learn about some things that occurred in this house, some very creepy things, and Kane from the present day is discovering facts about this house. And then in the 1906 timeline, we have Ivy, and her father is a doctor, and they find a dead woman on the property of Foster Hill. It was an interesting book. I did really enjoy it. I think because I had really low expectations, it made me enjoy it more. So I think it's solid. I don't think it's amazing, but it was definitely a book that kept me wanting to read more. So that is The House on Foster Hill. Another 3.5-star book is Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. And this could have easily been a 4.5, even 5-star read. I absolutely loved the atmosphere. I loved the writing. I loved the creep factor. It was very subtle, but it was there. But I really really got bogged down in the middle of the book. It was so slow moving, and I was really frustrated with the middle chunk of the book. It was just way too slow for me. This book could have been cut down by 100 pages and still told the same story in a very effective manner. That's just my personal opinion. So this book, we basically have a tavern, like an inn on the River Thames, and during the night this man shows up holding a dead girl in his arms. It appears she has drowned. He is very, very injured, and so they put them in separate rooms. His wounds are tended to, and then the nurse goes to check on this girl, and she ends up coming back to life. And so they're like, what just happened? This girl was dead. She had no heartbeat. And so the woman that went to check on her is just like absolutely shocked that this girl is alive, but she is mute. She does not speak. And so nobody knows exactly who she is. And then we have two couples and this other woman who all claim that she is their relation in some way. So we have a couple saying that this girl is their granddaughter, a couple saying she is their daughter, and then this other woman saying she is her sister who had drowned. Each of their claims are very difficult to prove, and so this book is basically the mystery of who this girl is and where she came from and things like that. And that aspect was really interesting. And you know, this mute girl who doesn't really show a lot of emotion, it was just very unsettling, and I liked that aspect of the book. Again, the atmosphere was just beautiful. This author has a way with words. And normally I don't get bogged down by slower moving plots if the characters interest me, but in this case, I don't know what it was about the characters. I just wasn't as like attached to them, and I didn't really have a desire for any of them to succeed in, you know, their attempts at laying claims to this girl. And then the ending was interesting. It was not what I expected, and I don't know how I feel about it. I still don't know how I feel about it. So overall, not a terrible book at all. This author is an amazing writer, but it is a 3.5-star book for me, so not an all-time favorite for sure, but still an interesting one if you would like something a little more atmospheric. This one is a good one. I also read this massive book called the Forsyte Saga, and this one took so long to read, but I really enjoyed it, and I have never heard anyone talk about this book. I found it at a thrift store a couple years ago and just picked it up on a whim. I saw that it said saga, so I'm like, okay, this is probably a family saga. It's something I want to try. And what I'm learning about myself is that I really like family sagas, and so I'm really, really glad I read this. I ended up giving it 4 stars. This book is there's just so much that goes on in this book. But at the heart of this book is the Forsyte family, and we start off with a generation that is just a bunch of siblings, and they're all like the older Forsyte generation, a ton of siblings. And then later in the book, we have the second generation who, where we have a man named Soames, and he is basically one of the like central characters of this book. And then later in the book, we get Soames's son and like that generation. So it's basically covering 3 main generations of the Forsyte family. This book just tackles so much about life and family and what it is like to have a big family with so many different people, so many different personalities. And this book, oh my gosh, it just deals with some really, really hard topics. The central conflict of this book is that Soames, who is in the like middle generation in the story, his wife does not love him, and he ends up becoming very, very bitter, and he does some atrocious things to this woman. And Soames is one of the most morally gray characters, more on the immoral side of things, but he's very, very morally gray. His wife, Irene, she is suffering because she's in a loveless marriage, and this book deals with like being unfaithful and things like that. So that was, you know, quite sad to read. I normally don't like books that have cheating in them, but I just think it was used in a very effective way in this book to tell the story that the author was trying to tell. A really interesting theme in this book is actually property and ownership, and all that the characters, especially Soames and the older generation, all they talk about is property, property, property. My house, my wife, like this person belongs to me, this land belongs to me, this money belongs to me. Like that's a huge, huge theme in this book. Like it was repeated a lot. Like you saw the word property and possessions and things like that quite a lot in the book. I really liked how the story was told. It felt so realistic, and I was super, super attached. I was super attached to the characters. I just wanted to know how are their stories going to end. Like this book was really, really good. So if you like family sagas, I would highly recommend. The nice thing about this book, and I actually didn't know it going in, is that it's actually 3 books. So I read the bind up. The 3 books are called The Man of Property, and then we have book 2, which is In Chancery, and then book 3 is To Let. So each of the 3 books deal more with like the specific generations that are at the heart of the book. Anyways, I could keep going on about this because there's so much to unpack in this book, but a very interesting take on intergenerational issues and family issues. So this was an interesting one. There are 2 books that I gave 4.5 stars to. So first we have Bridge to Haven by Francine Rivers. And this one was really, really good. It definitely packed an emotional punch. In this one, we have a girl named Abra who was abandoned as a baby by her mother. And it takes place in the 1950s. And she's taken in by this pastor and his son, but this pastor can't cope with the loss of his wife. And so Abra ends up moving in with a new family. And she still like sees the pastor around, but she's so bitter and she just feels so abandoned and like no one truly loves her. She doesn't really get along with her adoptive sister, and there's just so much bitterness and emotional turmoil that Abra is dealing with. And so she is a very naive and impressionable young teenager, and she is swept away by this very awful young man he's very rich and very handsome. And he is basically the catalyst for Abra's downward spiral. And so she ends up in Hollywood, she ends up modeling. But sadly, Abra's turmoil does not end just because she is successful. So this book really dives deep into some really difficult topics, and there are definitely trigger warnings for this, although they are spoilers for the book. So if you would like to know trigger warnings, I would look them up, but just be wary that there are spoilers. I just couldn't quite give it a 5 stars. There were a couple things that bothered me, and one of them was a very unnecessary wedding night scene. And it's not just because of the scene itself, but it kind of glossed over certain aspects of healing that need to occur in a person's life who has sexual trauma. And I just don't think that it was explored enough or in a good way. That's all I'm gonna say. I don't want to spoil anything. 4.5 stars, a really impactful read, and Francine Rivers, she is awesome. So this is a really, really good book. My other 4.5 star read from this month was Under the Tulip Tree, and this is by Michelle Shockley. And this book was so beautiful. This one is another one set during the Great Depression, so I'm glad I read 2 books set during this time. And basically, the main character, Lorena, is down on her luck. Her whole family, they're really struggling to make ends meet. Her dad used to be a very wealthy banker. After the stock market crash, he ends up becoming an alcoholic. And so Lorena is trying to basically work for her family to survive. And so she ends up getting this job interviewing former slaves, and it is a very difficult thing for her because her ancestors used to own slaves. And so she's interviewing this woman named Frankie, and so this book is basically a dual timeline. We get the 1930s timeline, and then we also get Frankie's experience during the Civil War era. And Frankie is actually in her 100s. She's 101, and she's a very old woman, and she has some incredible stories to share with Lorena. And so Lorena was basically hired by the government to interview former slaves. And wow, this book packed such an emotional punch. Frankie's stories, like, they made me tear up. It was such a good book. Like, I would highly recommend this to anyone who's interested in slavery, Civil War era, the Great Depression. Oh, it was just so beautifully explored, and it was very heartbreaking. I absolutely adored Frankie as a character. I personally did not find the love interest for Lorena necessary. It was just kind of random, and this book could have easily been a 5 stars without that love interest. Like, he didn't play the biggest role in the story, and it was just kind of just thrown in there. But wow, this book I would highly, highly recommend. And this book I actually read for the Christian Fiction Readathon, and I'm so glad it was picked as the group read. It was beautiful, beautiful story. This next book, I'm looking back now, and I don't think it's a 5-star read. I gave it 5 stars because I was very, very emotionally invested the last like 3 chapters. And once the book ended and, you know, things were resolved, I was just so like emotional over it. Ended up giving it a 5 stars. Looking back now, it's more like a 4-star read, but it's okay. I'll leave my 5-star rating. It really got me in the feels towards the end. And that is The Martian. And this one, wow, this one is so interesting. I've never read any sci-fi like it. So this one we have a man, and I forget his name because I always forget character names. Anyways, he ends up stranded on Mars. He was on a mission with his crewmates and he ends up stranded. He doesn't make it back onto the ship. There's this big storm that comes through, and this whole book is him trying to survive on Mars with very little to help and sustain him. And he is a very smart man. He's an engineer. He just uses his brains to survive, and he grows his own potatoes, and it's really, really interesting. All the science and math just over my head. Like I'm so overwhelmed when I try to follow the science and math, and that's one reason why I probably would have given it a 4-star, just because I was really like struggling to comprehend everything this guy was saying. And then like back at NASA, there were other perspectives of people that were trying to communicate with Mark and all the science there, and it was a lot. But Mark was hilarious. Is his name Mark? Did I remember his name? We'll just go with Mark. Mark was hilarious and so fun to follow. And oh my gosh, like towards the end, my heart was just, whew, it was really, really good. It was a really good ending. It was really funny. There were really good themes of like friendship and bravery and problem solving and mental health. And oh, so good, so good. So that is The Martian. And then I also read a short fairy tale retelling called Fairest Son. This was so good. So it's a retelling of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and basically it's like a gender bent retelling where Snow White, or the fairest in the land, is actually a fairy prince, and his name is Idris. And then we have a huntswoman named Kiva, and she was basically tasked to find this fairy prince. And that's all I'm really gonna say about that. And then we also have 7 goblins who, they're all like a caricature of the 7 dwarves, and they were just so cute. I really, really loved this. The writing was really, really good. I think this is a self-published novella on Kindle, and there were some like grammatical errors and spelling errors, but I'm not even gonna be picky about that because I was just swept off my feet. This was such a cute story. There are some like Christian themes in it, so I was definitely surprised about that, but in a good way. And I want to read more of this beautiful woman who has created this story because she is basically a fairy. I will insert her Instagram in the description box. She's literally like, she's obsessed with fairies, and I am here for it. It's also inspired by Irish folklore. So we have the Seelie and the Unseelie courts. It is honestly one of the best novellas I've ever read. The pacing was spot on. For a novella, and a very short one at that, I think the author did a really good job with the character development. Like it's hard to write a really good story in so short a number of pages. So I loved it. I would highly recommend. I don't think it's a perfect story at all, but it was perfect for me. It was awesome and very atmospheric, and oh, so good. 5 stars. So the last 2 books I want to talk about, I can't decide which one is my favorite because they're both 5 stars and they're both amazing, and I literally just want to hug them and stare at the covers all day, and I love them so much. So first up, I guess I'll talk about Yours is the Night by Amanda Dykes. I picked this one up at the library and I am so happy because this book was so good. Oh my Lord. So good. Okay, this book, it's World War II historical fiction, but it is such a unique story. Like I've never read anything like it. The writing made it feel like a fairy tale. Like I can't even describe to you how beautiful the writing is. Wow, I honestly, like, it's like a fairy tale. The author is just, this woman can write a story. And not only that, there are 5 different perspectives in this book, and normally that can be a bit intimidating. And it's hard to give each character a very unique and strong voice of their own and make, change the tone between characters and everything. But every time the point of view shifted, even though the name is written at the start of the chapters, I wouldn't even have needed that there because I just knew right off the bat, based on the way that the writing slightly altered who the character was. Like just incredible writing and incredible characterization. Oh, this author. So the premise of this book, we have a group of soldiers who are in the forest chopping down wood, and one of them is from America. He is the main character named Matthew. And then we have a British chaplain named George, and he is the funniest character. Like, oh my gosh. You need to read this book just so you can experience George's antics and everything that comes out of this guy's mouth, because he is hilarious. So we have Matthew, George, and then we have a writer from America. So he is like a journalist that is writing for the American government, explaining what's going on with the American army. And they're all in France, and they're in this forest, cutting down some trees. And then they hear this very beautiful, beautiful, whimsical singing. And they find a girl named Mireille, and she has just experienced some very difficult things in her own life. And I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to spoil anything, even if they're minor spoilers. It's good to know as little as you can going into this book. And Matthew and Mireille develop a very special bond, and they find out some things about Mireille's family. And so they go on this quest. They are trying to get to Paris, and it's during the World War II. There are Germans everywhere, and it's just such a difficult land to navigate. And oh my gosh, the story is so beautiful. It is so much more than just another war story. Going back to the points of view, we have Matthew, Mireille, George, the journalist Henry, and then we also have Jasper Truitt, who is a like a captain in the army, and he is a very, very depressed man. And his story and his past is just so heartbreaking. And man, this book got me in so many different ways, like just incredible. 5 stars. Please check this author's work out if you have not yet. She is amazing, and I definitely need to get myself a copy of this book because I'm going to have to reread it at some point. It is incredible. So that is Yours is the Night. All right, so the last book that I want to talk about is by one of my favorite authors, and we have Jewel of the Nile by Tessa Afshar. I have a new favorite Tessa Afshar book now. Oh my gosh, this was so good. This was so good. So Tessa Afshar writes amazing biblical fiction, and this one is no exception to that. It is just incredible. What I really enjoyed about this one is that it is set during the time of the early church, but characters within the early church don't play as much of a role in the story. It's more young Christians like navigating their faith, and we definitely do have some characters from the Bible up here. We have Philip, who was an apostle, and I really loved seeing how he did play like a role in this book, even though it was a minor one, but he did play a role, and it was really nice to see that. So in this book, we have a girl named Charlene, and she is half Roman, half Cushite. And the kingdom of Cush was very prominent at this time in Lower Egypt, if I'm not mistaken. And basically her parents eloped, and, you know, they tried to start a life together, but the queen of Cush was very much against this. She stopped them, and then her parents ended up being like split apart. And her father went back to Cush, and her mother ended up going back to Rome, and she delivered Charlene, but then her mother died. And so Charlene has grown up basically not knowing who her father is. Her father's identity has always been hidden from her. Her Roman grandfather is a very hateful and awful man. And so Charlene just hasn't really been given love in her life. And she ends up in Cush, and she finds out that her father is still alive. And so she's trying to figure out who he is. Her questions lead her to Rome, and on her way to Rome, she ends up a stowaway on a ship, and the ship's captain is Theo. Theo is a character from Thief of Corinth and Daughter of Rome, and he is one of my favorite characters of all time. I absolutely adore him. And so Charlene and Theo meet, and sparks fly, and, you know, there's that whole romance subplot, but oh my gosh, their character development was just so well done. There is so much adventure in this book, so much action. Like, this book is just constantly moving, and there's never a point where it gets boring or slow paced or anything like that. Like, the pacing is immaculate. Everything about this book is so good. I really enjoyed the fact that Charlene, even though she is a Christian from the get-go, she still struggles, and she still has so many things and that she has to work through, and doubts, and, you know, she's not portrayed as this perfect Christian girl like a lot of characters in Christian fiction are. The human struggles are just so realistically portrayed and explored. I actually related to Charlene so much. She is very much a doubting Thomas, if you get that reference. That's exactly how I am, and she just needs constant reminders of, like, you know, God's goodness and his faithfulness and everything like that. So I definitely related to her, and it was just so beautiful to see her and Theo get to know each other. And there are just some adorable side characters in this book. Oh my gosh, I could not recommend it enough if you like Christian fiction. So good. A very realistic tale, and has some amazing family moments and found family, and oh, so good. Wow, that was a lot of talking. All right, so that is it for the books I read in May. It was quite a lot, and overall I think I had a really good reading month. I found a new favorite author. I read a book by one of my favorite authors and absolutely loved it. I discovered a new classic that I now absolutely love, and I'm just really, really happy that, you know, it was overall a great reading month. And I'm really curious to hear about your reading month. Please let me know in the comments what you guys read in May, or what your favorite books were, what stood out to you. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to listen to me ramble. It means the world to me, and I'm so grateful for each of my subscribers. Thank you guys so much. I hope to see you all in my next video, and I hope you're all having an amazing day wherever you are in the world. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!